Thank you, Larry, for your very generous introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here at the Harris School's Cultural Policy Center. And many thanks to the Dean and Betty Farrell and Larry for having me here today. And as Larry mentioned, I'm Vice Chairman of the Paulson Institute, which is here on campus, and we've had just a terrific experience with the Harris School and with the university overall. And as Larry said there, I focus on the other ancient civilization, China. But I'm here today to talk about something related to my passion as opposed to my profession. And that's an initiative that we launched at the Capitol Archaeological Institute, which I chair at George Washington University. And it's an attempt to address the rampant looting that has been taking place in Egypt since the time of the revolution, and how that's relevant to the much larger issue of overall antiquities crime. Larry asked me to talk a little bit about the process as well as the substance of our initiative. So I'll walk you through the steps of how we've gotten there, because it's been a very interesting process for me, particularly as a former trade negotiator with China, learning how other countries handle these types of negotiations. It's the complete opposite of what we had faced when we were dealing with the Chinese. And as we're a relatively small group here, I'm happy if you have any comments or thoughts as we go along. Just jump in and I'll answer any questions. But we launched our institute to focus on advocacy issues, just because we are in Washington, and to take advantage of that. We have a dedicated core of archaeologists led by our director, Dr. Eric Klein, and they're very dedicated both to promoting the science of archaeology as well as to their specific field work and the work that they're doing with the university. Given our proximity to National Geographic and the Smithsonian and Mount Vernon, and as well the U.S. government, which I found to my surprise is completely peppered with archaeologists, whether they're practicing or not, we have tried to become a bridge that brings together these various worlds, as well as the diplomatic community, to really try and focus on cultural heritage policy. So almost 3 years ago, Dr. Zahi Hawass, who was then the Minister of Antiquities and has really been the well-known face of Egypt's cultural heritage, came to Washington to formally launch our institute in October 2010. And it was just 3 months later that we watched in dismay, yet with great admiration, as Egyptians stood around the Cairo Museum to try and protect it from many of the vandals who were trying to break in. And I'm sure you recall many of these very moving images of when they were there and the items that had been looted or broken. And so these group of citizens who simply stood up to protect on their own the museum against the vandals, they inspired us. So given our relationship with Dr. Hawass, and we felt that we should do something to support him. So we started to check to see what was being done in the United States to try and help, particularly as we started hearing of looting going on at many of the key archaeological sites after the revolution. But as we looked around and checked with the major heritage institutions, we found that little more had been done than a group of press releases that had been issued to note that they deplored looting. And I'm not trying to be funny, but I'm sure that the looters actually never got those press releases. So we felt that we should try to help. And the U.S. government is actually able to take unilateral steps to protect international cultural heritage. The President's authority to do so stems from domestic law that's based on a 1970s United Nations Convention that was the first of its kind. The President designates these authorities to the State Department, as many as you may know, to the Assistant Secretary for Public Diplomacy and Cultural Heritage, and they administer those authorities through the Cultural Heritage Bureau, which I believe we have actually an alum of that bureau who had worked there previously with us today. But they're able to direct customs to invoke emergency restrictions on unauthorized imports of antiquities if necessary. And the FBI has the jurisdiction if there's a U.S. citizen who's involved in the trafficking or purchasing of these illicit antiquities. So our institute launched a call to action, a simple document calling for the President to direct the State Department to invoke these various authorities. And we launched it at 5 o'clock on a Friday, because of course it took us that long to try and get our act together and get the very specific legal language that we needed to have in the document. And we circulated it internationally. And by Monday morning, we had over 70 signatures of every major archaeological or Egypt-related institution around the globe, including several people from this university. We had the business community, we particularly had the tourism industry who was being hit, and were very supportive of our initiative, and we even had a couple of best-selling authors who signed on. One, Barbara Mertz, who was actually a graduate of this university. She got her PhD in Egyptology here, but is better known as Elizabeth Peters for her best-selling mystery novels. I don't know if any of you have read them, but they are about Egypt. So, having worked in the government, I realized that it does not react to a piece of paper. We had submitted this to the National Security Council, to the State Department, to the White House. We actually sent it up to the Hill as well. So we know that we needed to go in to pay a call on them. So we put a leadership group together from the Archaeological Institute of America, from National Geographic, a group of previous government officials, and we asked to pay a call on the Cultural Heritage Bureau. The assistant secretary there, Ann Stock, was way too busy to take time to meet with us, but we did meet with the head of the office there, and we understood very quickly why Ann was not able to take the time to meet with us, because their basic message to us was they would not do anything until the Egyptians came to ask for it. Now, I don't know about you, but in the midst of a revolution, you probably are not going to send a high-level team to Washington to negotiate an agreement on cultural heritage. You're going to be staying and watching what's happening in your country because you may not have a seat when you go home from that position. And we see the same thing with Libya. They were not going to send a group in the midst of their civil war, and the same thing with Syria today. And herein lies, I think, what is one of the major weaknesses of our cultural heritage policy, in that the U.S. tends to be very reactive instead of proactive. So we decided we would work directly with the Egyptian government. So after consulting broadly with the archaeological and the business community, we developed the basic elements of a plan, the first of its kind that we thought could support the Egyptian government's efforts to fight looting. And it would be, as Larry mentioned, a public-private partnership. It's our belief that any agreement had to have economics and job creation at its core in order to vest the local people in the long-term success of the agreement. Our role was not to come in and do the work, but to provide the resources and the capabilities and the training for the Egyptians to do the work. And once we had developed this white paper, we submitted that and our call to action to the Egyptian embassy, but we also sent it to the Supreme Commander of Egypt at the time, General Tantwani. And we wanted to demonstrate the concerns of the international community, but also that we thought that we had found a solution for them. Coincidentally, or we like to believe maybe it wasn't such a coincidence, that a week after submitting our petition, Dr. Hawass was reappointed as the Minister of Antiquities. He had been removed in a previous government reshuffle, one of the many that was going on at that time. He was put back into his position, and he was given a commitment by the Egyptian government that he could have the resources necessary to start to fight the looting. So our coalition was invited actually to Cairo in May 2011 to start a negotiation on the details of our proposed action plan. Now, while we continued to receive reports on the ground about increases in looting, there was a reluctance on the part of the Egyptian government to admit that it was actually taking place. Sorry, I'll go back in a minute. There was a concern, we believe, by the Ministry of Antiquities that they would look like they were not doing their job if they actually acknowledged the amount of looting that was going on, and they were not sharing details even with many of their colleagues. They were basically telling them that they had it under control. So what we needed to do was to find a way to prove, beyond just the anecdotal evidence that we were getting from archaeologists and others on the ground, that this was actually taking place. So let me go back, sorry, here. Here we go. So what we did is we commissioned satellite imagery that could prove whether or not there was increased looting taking place. So GOI is a company that does satellite imagery in the Washington, D.C. area. And they very generously opened their archives to us so that we could have baseline imagery that came from before the revolution to be a starting point. And we commissioned then new imagery to be taken place just before we were about to leave in early May so that we would have time for the analysis. But we had a little problem. You may recall that Osama bin Laden was actually taken out on May 2nd, and the government took over all the satellites. So we didn't get our imagery then until May 11th, almost as we were getting on the plane. But we have as part of our group one of the leading experts, not only on satellite imagery, but also who is an Egyptologist, Dr. Sarah Parka, who quickly did the imagery for us, and here is what it showed. Now, just to show you quickly as we get started. Well, one last thing, sorry. Looting, before we start, is obviously a very ancient profession, and we recognize that in times of crisis and economic and political unrest, that insiders, local people who have knowledge of these sites are going to start to dig for pots, for hopefully gold, for anything that they can find to sell. But we were seeing on the scale that the looting was taking place and on the distribution that we were finding into international markets that actually organized crime had moved in. And we call this something, to distinguish it from the looting, we have adopted the term cultural racketeering because it's syndicated gangs with shopping lists who are moving in. So let me show you what we shared with the Egyptian government. This, just as a baseline for those of you who aren't archaeologists, is actually a site in Israel, Megiddo, where the University of Chicago started excavations in 1920. It's the biblical site of Armageddon. And there's a big collection, actually, in the Oriental Institute of finds there. And GW now is co-head of this dig. But you'll see how neatly and organized these excavations are. Archaeologists have very systematically removed the layers, versus the looters have a distinct pattern as well. Their holes tend to look like a donut. The center tends to be a tomb, which they found, so there's a hole that you can see in the imagery. Then they leave the sand around the edges. So these are on the ground level. As we walked through some of the areas where we'd heard about the looting, you can see the pits in comparison that they had dug. And you can see they found items. Now this is pre-revolution, obviously, in Abu Sir. It looks very clean. This, February, right after the revolution. See the holes? They look like donuts. These are the looter pits. These are in the same area, actually, where we were doing the walking of the pits that you can see. And May, I know this one's hard to see, but it's spread out into this area. And again, you can see all the looter holes. And the other issue, this dark area, urban encroachment. Now that the boundaries are being marked by the police, the citizens are moving and building illegally onto the ancient sites. This is even worse. This is an area where there were unexcavated tombs. The local people went, bulldozed the tombs, and have built a modern cemetery over the site. You can see how quickly that's it blank. And if you see in some of the imagery, you can see little rectangles. Those are some of the, like here, imagery. Those are some of the tombs. That's the cemetery. Dashur, same thing, 2011, you can start to see. Look at the difference. Again, this is this year. We picked key sites just to use as a baseline to start to track. You can see the progression. We think in Lisht, it's up about 400% since the revolution. El Hiba has gotten a lot of media attention. The excavator there has been very vocal and about what's been happening at her dig and posting things on Facebook and other things, but you can see the changes, which are just phenomenal. There we think it's up about 200%. And we know that they found items as we walked through the areas, broken caskets, mummy wrappings, bones, pottery fragments. So our Egyptologists think that only about 5% of what is under the sand has actually been excavated. So you can imagine, in recent imagery we found there are about 3,100 previously unknown archaeological sites. There are about 1,000 new tombs, 17 new pyramids. So there's a lot for the thieves to find. And it's not just that they're digging in these sites, they're also breaking into the storage units and the local museums. One of the challenges that we found with the storage units is that there are no, and you can see how simple they are to break in. I mean, these just have padlocks in them. So if there's no armed guard there, it's easy for them to get in. The challenge is there's no national inventory of what's in these storage units. So we don't even know actually what has been stolen. And this lack of records is not unique to Egypt. It's across many of the Middle Eastern and Latin American countries. But it's astonishing when you think of how long excavations have been going on in Egypt. Each individual site may have their own record, but as the Egyptian government, there is no master record. So Cairo was actually, when we arrived, an armed camp. We had to fight our way through personnel carriers. That's the foreign ministry in the background there. Through security, tanks. This is the front of the foreign ministry. We had to come through the back because of what was happening with the revolution. Now, why did we start with a foreign ministry? It's not what you think of typically when you're going to negotiate an agreement on archaeology. But the most immediate reason, as you can tell from these previous pictures, of why the looting is so rampant now is because the breakdown in the police state, essentially, and the lack of an armed presence at many of these sites. The men who are responsible for guarding the archaeological sites are not armed. And the tourism police, who used to be ubiquitous at the sites, were actually stationed there after the terrorism attack in the late 1990s in Luxor. But their mission is to protect the tourist, not to protect the site. So many of these guards who do this, they tend to be elderly men, have been doing this and have been risking their lives in trying to protect these sites against armed guards, but it's very difficult. So in order to enlist the support of the police, we needed a ministry that could have the authority to bring them to the table, and it was not going to be the Ministry of Antiquities. Unfortunately, the Ministry of Antiquities in most countries tends to be one of the weakest ministries. They don't have much money, they don't have much authority, so what we couldn't rely on them to bring together all the elements of the Egyptian government that we needed to implement what would be a very broad-ranged plan.
Deborah, can I ask a question?
Yes.
My understanding is that the Ministry of Antiquities, that's Zahi Hawass's ministry, right?
Right.
My understanding is they had 35,000 people working for the ministry.
They have 35,000 who are not always gainfully employed. That is one of the issues that he had when he was there, because they continue to graduate archaeologists, but they aren't necessarily people who have specific positions and jobs. So they have a lot of people, but they're really very focused on just whatever it is in the cultural field. Part of our plan is to find ways to employ them, to train them and retrain them actually to be more sophisticated site guards and inspectors of these sites. But so we have the foreign ministry actually was willing to step up to the plate and actually bring together the kind of group that we needed. And we had an Egyptian undersecretary who was sitting across from us with the actual general of the tourism police, representatives from customs, from antiquities, from international cooperation, about 30 of them across from our small delegation of 6. So when we walked into the room, though, there was a great sense of wariness and defensiveness that we were going to come in and tell them what to do. So we simply walked them through the imagery that I showed you earlier. And by the end, there was no question that we were on the same side and looking to find solutions. Most of them actually had tears in their eyes because they had no idea how bad the situation had gotten. So our proposal includes immediate term, medium term, long term solutions for supporting the Egyptian government in this process. We've been negotiating this for 2 years now. It's May. We've gone through 4 foreign ministers, and today they announced a new Minister of Antiquities, so I think we're on our 5th Minister of Antiquities. Also, Zahi served twice during that time. We have finalized a letter of intent that will allow us to get started with the process this summer. And we're going to start with a very logical thing, a national inventory. National Geographic is bringing their many skills to start with putting together an inventory starting with the government magazine so that we have a list at least of what has already been excavated. And that will be published on the web in English and Arabic so that scholars all over the world will have access to it.
Oh, my goodness. You can't be serious.
Yes, that was part of our deal, that we would give them the resources and the training if they would do this. We also are working with them to develop a baseline satellite imagery map and train them to have sophisticated analysts of the imagery so that they can track the urban encroachment and the looting themselves. They have asked us to do also, which given your reaction there, you may like this as well, to create a digital library of all ancient texts that they would be scanned in, and again, that would be published. If we can get it all translated, it will be in English, but originally, obviously, it'll be published in Arabic and made available on the web. We're doing training for the tourism police. We don't talk about this a lot in Washington because it's so controversial now to be working with the police in Egypt, and we'll be training them through other entities, but to work with the tourism police on how actually to protect the sites, not just the humans, so that we can keep away some of these guards. We're doing training for customs on how to recognize genuine antiquities versus fakes. Often they're smuggled out as tourism items, dressed up to look like trinkets. And in the longer term, what we're trying to do is really vest people in the protection of the site themselves. We partnered with Sesame Street to work on a cultural heritage program to educate children, because we found in working with Sesame Street that their methods, if you educate children, you tend to educate families. So we're picking key sites and have working with their Egyptian partner, rolling out that program, we hope, later this year. And we've partnered with Goldman Sachs and their 10,000 Women program, and they have a program that they've had in place for 5 years now with the goal of educating 10,000 women around the world. Egypt is one of their core markets for this program. It's with the American University in Cairo, and they select women entrepreneurs. They put them through a mini MBA program, and then they mentor them. And we're looking at working with the groups who are working in, whether it's the service industry or the local handicraft industry, and developing a program with the Ministry of Tourism that would give them preferential access to sites around key archaeological areas so that they can develop local businesses and hopefully, once they're tourists again, get funding from the tourists who are coming through so that they have a vested interest in protecting that site. So based on our imagery analysis and conducting the on-the-ground visual assessments and tracking anecdotal evidence, we believe conservatively, and these are very new numbers that we've gotten just this week in our analysis, the cost to Egypt of this cultural racketeering ranged from about $3 billion to $5 billion since the revolution. And just to give you a little bit of context, this is in a country where tourism accounts for 11% of their GDP, and at the height of the tourism industry, their revenues were $14 billion. So potentially the cost is half of what their revenues are in their tourism industry. Now the FBI has on its website, and we don't know if these statistics are right or not, but that art and antiquities crime accounts for about $6 billion annually. We think it has to be a lot higher than that. Obviously that's just what they know and can track. But it's the third largest crime after drugs and guns. But you don't hear people talk a lot about it. It's highly profitable. It's easy to smuggle these items, certainly a lot easier than smuggling suitcases of cocaine or suitcases of cash or humans. But the distribution networks are often the same. Once these criminal syndicates have set up distribution networks, it's easy to funnel anything through them. And there's plenty of demand. I mean, we see articles in the papers around the world. Even today there was one about 2 Palestinians who were smuggling gold, ancient gold, out through underground tunnels through the Sinai. And Israel, and Morag knows, Israel is one of the key exit points for a lot of these illicit antiquities that are being then sent around to major capitals in the world. And the resources that are dedicated to fighting this, at least in the United States, are pretty pathetic. For the FBI, they have 10 people in their arts crime unit. There's no one really at a local level who has any sophistication in understanding art and antiquities crime. In the UK, at Scotland Yard, I think they have 20, so they have double what we have. But it's not significant when you think about the resources that are dedicated to drugs and to guns. UNESCO, who's got the lead in fighting cultural heritage globally, is reactive, not proactive. We Our delegation was in Egypt 1 week after a UNESCO team had been there. You saw our evidence. They declared that there was no looting, that it was all under control, and they left. And they've only gone back in recent months. And they have been virtually inactive in Libya and Syria and the other countries who are facing very, very similar challenges. It took a major fire of one of the libraries in Mali to get them to react in any way, and they're actually doing similar things to what we're doing. They're trying to digitize records to save them. But there's no real long-term solution that they're developing in any context. So no wonder the criminals find this very profitable. Most disturbing are reports that we get as we really start to delve into this, that terrorists are finding this as a very profitable way to raise funds. There are reports of Al-Qaeda using this, of the Syrian opposition raising funds through selling antiquities, and many others. We think it merits not only the attention of law enforcement, but the attention of the State Department. We have a new Assistant Secretary coming in. We hope that she will be much more sympathetic to some of these issues than the previous one. But our institute, and also with the wonderful support of the Cultural Policy Institute, has been thinking of launching an initiative to try and address these issues. We want to highlight the problem of cultural racketeering. We are researching patterns of looting because we see in Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Latin America, they're very similar patterns that based on that research, we could start to develop early warning systems for countries and work with them on crisis management for cultural heritage as a way to prepare and also have teams of law enforcement, diplomats, archaeologists, political experts who can work with those countries in times of crisis like we're doing with Egypt. And we hope that Egypt will end up being the test case for what we're trying to accomplish in addressing at least this bigger issue of cultural racketeering. We're not Pollyanna-ish, and we know that we'll never stop basic looting. But at least if we can start to shut down the illicit networks that are being run globally, we can do something good. So we hope we can have all of your support. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. Yes.
Go back to
And you just can't tell Mr. Paulson that I'm doing this.
One thing's a whole.
Yes.
Explain to me how this works and how long do you have to be there digging to hopefully find something? Do you know, is it organized or individuals that just come out with a shovel? Or how's this done?
In some cases, there are very shallow pits. People are coming out with shovels. Maybe there are people who've been workmen on previous excavations and they know where some of these items are. But what we've really seen over time is that they're bringing in, it's gangs of people, typically men. They're bringing in bulldozers or large-scale earth-moving equipment, and they're digging. And they know where to dig because of historic patterns. They know basically, and there are many, many tombs to be found. And so that's where you're seeing a lot of the digging. So no, it's not really just somebody with a shovel. It's big teams going out and looking for these items.
Are they apprehended from time to time, and are they incarcerated? And is there a system for discouraging this from the Egyptian government at all?
Theoretically, yes. There are systems in place. I mean, under basic rules, I think since the 1980s, anything that is found is automatically in the possession of the Egyptian government. So if you have it and it's been dug up after 1980, then theoretically you have it illicitly. The challenge is the breakdown of the police state, that there just aren't the people out there patrolling, and this doesn't have the kind of priority that other political issues have right now in terms of the focus of law enforcement. But yes, people are apprehended from time to time, and we've heard of there's some local crime networks that have moved into a couple of these areas, and that they are arrested, they're held for a little while, and they're let go. But it's still very high, it's highly profitable, and these international syndicates have shopping lists to tell them basically what to look for, what gets the most money in the international markets, and then there are systems, and we're exploring a little more some of the networks of how they're getting them out of the country.
In one case, it took over a whole town, right? I mean,
Yep.
They actually took over the town, so.
Yes.
I may add, or I may answer you. I'm from Egypt, actually. It's a huge problem between 5 o'clock until 8 o'clock in the morning next day. All the day from 8 until 5 p.m. it's guarded by the policemen. After 5 o'clock, the policemen leave. Then from 5 o'clock all the way until 8 o'clock next day morning, it's managed by the army. And the whole area of Giza, Saqqara, Abu Sair, Dahshur, until Bani Suef, until Al-Lesht, this whole area just has one camp. This one camp, maybe 100 soldiers, 500 soldiers, and they are just staying, they are not protecting. So they just close the area, and the policemen leave, and as all the people believe there that the army is guarding this area. So the people go during the night, stay for the whole night, they can find anything to take them out of this area, and the next day, they stay, and they go again. So each night they have like 10 hours today. They go there with loaders, with very huge machines, bulldozers. They don't care, they just want to dig and discover what underneath. So they have the time to do all of these things without any control.
That's right. And
Set up
sometimes they
concession
have
stands, right? Yeah. Seriously.
How were you able to get this far? I'm just surprised, given the reshuffling of the government constantly in the last 2 years. And did you find any resistance with certain people, or did you find that this one subject area was something that unified everyone who might have been otherwise politically divided?
Oh, that's a great question. First, it's not politically sensitive, so that was an easy issue. And we tried to couch it in a way that we were not here telling people that there was something wrong, that we were simply trying to work to help solve problems together. As I alluded to in the beginning, I used to be a trade negotiator with China, and with China, you would fight and fight and fight and fight, and finally you'd get your agreement, sign it, and you'd move on to the next phase. In Egypt, it's been completely the opposite. We negotiated the public-private partnership. Zahi Hawass decided he was going to scoop the foreign ministry. He announced it the night before to the media that it had been signed and what the elements were. The next day, the foreign ministry published the agreement on their website. They put out our press release. And 2 years later, we're still waiting for a signed agreement. We have not been able to get anyone in the government to actually sign the agreement. And that's been the issue because the ministers won't put their signatures on anything. So that has been the frustrating part. And it's been, a little tenacity. I went to Egypt in September as part of a delegation, and we had the privilege to meet President Morsi. We spent an hour and a half with him. The foreign minister was there. I literally backed him into a corner and said, I can't believe you haven't signed this agreement. We have this agreement. We're ready to help. Can you please sign it? And he called the Minister of Antiquities, who was, of course, new, went over, met with him. He agreed to it on the spot, added a couple of things, and we're still waiting. Now he's just been removed today. But the Egyptian embassy has been terrific, actually, in keeping it up. And we do have a few champions there, which is the real key, who are helping, and we're just keeping up the pressure. And we've told them, particularly with this 2-year anniversary, we wanted to get the dollar figures around this, that the international community is watching to see how the new government is going to handle these issues, that they are going to be held responsible for the loss of not just Egypt's antiquities, these are a common shared heritage of all of us, and that we would turn to publicizing this if we don't start to see some action on implementation. Yes.
Deborah, that was fascinating. I have a question about the demand side, because people are looting, somebody wants it. And we all can acknowledge that the West is where this material is going. So is your institute and the program that you guys have developed doing anything about first training U.S. inspectors, customs agents? And what are you doing on this side? Or are you only focused on the Egypt side?
We, being in Washington, to me, when I did the intellectual property rights negotiations with China, it's a very similar process. The issues are the same, whether it's recognizing, fake goods coming out or it's recognizing antiquities, you're dealing with the same structure and same set of issues. But I think there are a lot of groups here that train U.S. Customs that we didn't see we had any real value added. If you have a different impression, we would like to consider it. But we didn't feel that was necessarily our value added, given that there's so many, the AIA does it, various other groups are working with customs, and so we felt that we were better working on the foreign side, particularly given the kind of cold reaction we got initially from the U.S. government. Yes.
What incentives can you offer the Egyptian government or any government that's in distress? I mean, we talked about Syria now, or I mean, we can go on and on. What incentives can you offer? Because, of course, the value of the trade in these looted items is only a value if you're actually selling them, but the government is not selling them. So every object that's found is an additional burden for them. So what can you offer that gives them incentive to make this a priority when they've got a lot of other things they're worrying about?
That's a really good question. I mean, obviously, we're not going to compensate in a financial sense. So I think part of it just has to be public face, that the embarrassment that they're not actually handling these issues. And even though people don't report a lot on the fact that the looting is so significant, whenever there is a find, it is always reported and gets a lot of attention. So we focus somewhat on that part. The other part that we're trying to do is really tie it into this whole issue of and this is why we have the term cultural racketeering, into the bigger issue of illicit networks. And groups like Google Ideas and others are trying to move away from a focus on a very specific issue, such as drugs or human trafficking, recognizing that the patterns are very similar across a lot of these crimes, and that what we can do is start to look at what methods we have to shut down some of these networks and where the choke points are. Something else that we're doing in the context of our agreement is we've talked very quietly to a large number of the investment banks, and you can start to track exchanges of money. And while we can obviously have access to financial transactions, what we can do is work with the banks in setting up red flags of what to look for. So when they see certain transactions going to, whether it's between certain countries or it's certain individuals and these kinds of things, they can know to watch out for that and look into those transactions a little bit more clearly to see if it's illegal. But really, we just have to keep up the outside pressure. I mean, ultimately, we're supplicants. And it's at their goodwill and their political will that we serve. That's the challenge. Yes.
I think there are some sensibilities that also have to be recalled in this whole thing. You're mentioning that the initial reaction was press releases. But there was a lot more than that, because the overseas research centers in Egypt, the American, the German, the Dutch, others, we were all very, very concerned about this, obviously. And primarily because we were partners with Egypt, we did not want to first offend them by saying, you've got a problem and you're not able to deal with it. And this was a major, big problem for us, because we drafted all sorts of different types of letters of support. But they were letters of support because you want to also not invoke the old neocolonialism. And for Egypt, who forever has had problems with the British, the French, the Americans moving in and wanting to basically take control over their past, this was something that was a big, big issue for us.
Right.
And I think what you're doing is I'm glad about parts of it, but I am concerned about the U.S. government coming in very, very strongly, particularly over the heads of the established research institutes there who have long-term partnerships with the Egyptian government to do a lot of what you're doing.
Well, I don't think you have to worry about the U.S. government coming in anytime soon with any kind of heavy hand, because I don't see them being involved. More what we're interested in that context is the U.S. government picking up the bigger issue of understanding that they need to make cultural heritage policy a priority in the context of their foreign policy with a number of these countries. I'm not saying to necessarily single out Egypt. But as we're looking at areas where politically we can build goodwill, I think this is a very clear one with countries in the Middle East, that the United States can be doing training programs and support, funding programs for Egyptian archaeologists or Syrian archaeologists to come for training in the U.S. and those kinds of things. Our initiative does not involve the U.S. government. We would like their support domestically. I think the benefit of ours, and I understand completely what you're saying, and I know that ASOR and others were in a very difficult position, and ASOR did not sign on to our initiative, unlike RC did. ASOR did not. A number, AIA did, and others. But I understand there's a sensitivity when you are on the ground and you have to get permits from the Ministry of Antiquities and you have to deal with the system from within the system, that you don't want to be critical. We fully understand that. You're on the front line, you're implementing these programs. But at some point, I think there needs to be a little bit of outside pressure to bring about some change. And if it's handled in the right way, it's surprising what kind of results. And I will tell you, I heard these criticisms, and there were people who were very reluctant to sign on initially. The reaction that we have gotten from the Egyptian government has been overwhelmingly supportive, overwhelmingly, even from the Ministry of Antiquities. They may be nervous politically to put their signature on, but they're constantly asking us when we're going to start. And it's been my reluctance, because I did not want to start fundraising, which is necessary for implementation of this, before I had a signed commitment from them, because we couldn't guarantee how the money, if we didn't have a signed commitment, they could renege on their obligations that we'd raised this money for. But if we have their signature on it, we know that there's the political will to commit to implementation. They keep wanting us to start. For 2 years, they've been asking us that. But we've been reluctant, as I said, until we had it signed. So now we're looking at some kind of compromise that will let us, which is this letter of intent, which will let us, because the clearance now has to go back to the Ministry of Antiquities, but it also has to go back through the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of International Cooperation, all the elements who are part of this agreement. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.